So that's just purely for the taping. Okay.
Right. I think what we... I want to officially welcome you here to a rather unique event at SCI-Arc here in the Architecture Gallery. Now that you've had a chance to look at the drawings in the Herron Cook Show, we've asked Peter Cook if he would give us a little more information, a little perhaps on some of the artwork, and it's kind of a special thing that we've not done before. So I would like to introduce to you Peter Cook.
Thank you. Well, since there was this strange thing about two dates being mixed up, and so Ron and I actually gave a lecture the other evening, as some of you might know. So it seemed a pity that if people were going to turn up this evening, that there was a sort of a great nothing. And anyway, I think that the way in which one talks about drawings in front of you might be quite different from the sort of distilled image when it is seen in a lecture. In a way, as I think I said in that lecture, you can distort the truth if the drawing is ever the truth anyway. You can play with slides and with the way in which a lecture is made quite differently from standing in front of an artwork. Now, this evening, Ron has already left, and therefore I have to talk to his work, with which I am moderately familiar, and I had the useful prompt of the lecture the other evening. I think one thing, and also I've been asked if I would talk a little bit about the actual drawing technique. Now, for those of you, particularly those of you who are in the school here, for whom that is a special concern, I have decided to make my first of my 3 Monday evening lectures or seminars on the subject of drawings. Not sort of how to use the airbrush, which everybody keeps asking about, which I think is an extremely boring thing to talk about, and books have you know, how to hold the nozzle and all these things. What I want to talk about on Monday are drawings as idea. In other words, one's feeling that a certain kind of architectural concept, a certain kind of intention, and the representation of, in many cases, a certain kind of hardware, demands a certain kind of drawing. Now, I don't want to preempt next Monday. What I wanted to talk about is the exhibition per se. And I think that the first thing that comes to my mind is that Ron's work is very much more consistent than mine. It's consistent in its drawing style, and it's consistent in its pitch, that in the main, his exhibit here today is discussing a very outlandish proposition, really, which is that the normal complete architecture should be challenged by or replaced by an architecture of sets, of decoys, of phony architecture, if you like, and that by erecting these sets, one is questioning, I think, the whole process of the history of correct building. Not only correct building in terms of style, but correct building in terms of the relationship between the image of the building as it is seen by the general public and the nature of its content. Now, this is very special to Los Angeles, because I think his first project in this direction happened only after he had spent about 2 years in this city. And also, the first drawings that we have here, the project Urban Sets, is in many respects making a recognition of the work of Charles and Ray Eames up on the hill. I don't know how it comes across to you, but I think the Eames house has a very special place for English architects. It's probably enjoyed. Again, it's this question of seeing the thing distilled through film, through slides. It has a very special place in English architecture schools. The film of the Eames House has been shown many times. I've never really looked very closely at the Eames House on previous visits to the city. I've seen it sort of from a distance. But I have seen the film many times. I'm not sure. I sometimes think that the distilled image is more powerful than the real thing. I sometimes think that a purple object on the ground is so weird and wonderful and evocative that it's much better than the sort of slightly pale biscuit-colored object that the thing might really be in reality. Just as the process of reversal of the drawing forces you to pay very special attention to that, whatever it might be, as opposed to this. Now, I very rarely use the same techniques as Ron. I have made drawings that are reversed art, but I find that for me personally, the process is too concerned with the diagram. And I think to Ron, the diagram is extremely important. I notice that he, and I admire this, I wish I could do it, but I can't. He uses a whole mixture of types of drawing, of types of description on the same piece of card. Here is something which, since it is specially colored and very particularly colored, must be seen as a picture. But on the other hand, it is full of straight, almost computer-like information. On this sheet, the pictures of the model are actually the most important architectural thing, and particularly the picture of the mechanical dog, tremendously important. Yet the largest space is occupied by this, which is a more or less traditional axonometric from above. And in the end, it has, to me, a very experimental quality. Now, the other thing that Ron can do is to make sketches. And he makes these all the time. I mean, these are just a tiny, tiny gleaning from his sketchbooks. This is a traditional device. I think that it goes way back into the 18th century or before, that architects would make sketches, and then somebody, maybe them, but maybe somebody else, would make the finalized drawing. I can't do that. I am not a good sketcher. I was not a good sketcher as a schoolboy, and I'm not a good sketcher now. I do scribble, not particularly in notebooks. I scribble on almost anything. Usually when I'm sitting in very boring meetings, I take the minutes of the meeting, which are stapled together on one side, and I turn them over and start scribbling on the back. And as soon as I start getting the idea moving in my head, I start thinking of the whole project. And in fact, I spend a lot of time just walking along or doing whatever I'm doing, working out a scheme in my head. And when it seems to be nearly ready, I start drawing it. And usually scrap the drawing 1 or 2 or even 3 times. I'm not a sketcher. I admire people who can sketch. I admire the relative powerfulness of this soft corner add-on. Because in a sense, the lack of apparatus, if you say that most of the drawings around here have a lot of apparatus, have a lot of linear information of detail, in the sketch, you get straight to the point. It is a weirdo corner to a straight building. End of conversation, and the sketch is able to do that. In some ways, there is something about this, and I'm acting this rather curious. I mean, I can't help it this evening. I'm acting kind of as critic to my friend's work, and I'm not criticizing, but I'm acting, I have to speak objectively to it. That, to me, there is some quality of this drawing which tells you about the dynamic of it, because the front set of lines is slightly thicker than the back set of lines, which, with respect, is lost in the colored drawing. The colored drawing is very pretty and very nice, and you know, there's this sort of acid green which is more green than green, and if you've been to that part of Berlin, it never looks like that at all. It's sort of, you know, usual municipal green with the Russians sort of just the only thing that dramatizes the existence of the Russians just up there somewhere. But this, for my money, tells me about the scheme. It tells me that it is to do with this flimsy thing which breathes. And that you can get across in a sketch. On the other hand, this is a very powerful image. I think the Berliners would hate it and love it at the same time. They are very po-faced about the Kongresshalle because it was, after all, a gift from the Americans. It's in that patch of Berlin which lies between the sort of developed up part of West Berlin and the Reichstag. It's in the Tiergarten, which is, for anybody who's been there, you'll remember, it's a rather spooky place. I mean, it starts off back near the zoo station as a perfectly normal sort of public park with kids and toys and ice creams and trees and all very nice. And then gradually, as you get nearer and nearer the Reichstag and to the wall, the atmosphere stiffens and the buildings along the side of the Tiergarten get thinner and thinner, and some of the old embassy buildings have never been rebuilt. They just stand there as sort of empty shells, and it gets spooky. And then Hugh Stubbins was commissioned to build this munificence from the Americans, this piece of look no hands post-war architecture. Since it's look no hands and it's sort of collapsed embarrassingly. I have a suspicion that what will actually happen is that they will just quietly rebuild it, despite the fact they have a much larger exhibition and conference hall near Tegel Airport now. Now the suburban sets, you see, the thing about Ron is that he lives in a very, very nice, as he said in his lecture, he lives in a very nice suburb of London. It's extremely bourgeois. It's a suburb inhabited entirely by doctors and accountants and people in real estate. And it's an extremely pleasant place on a hill, and it has houses actually rather larger than these, rather more elaborate than these. And I think it shows his own love-hate for his own environment, in a sense, when, if I'm being slightly naughty here, but when he was talking about the architect's house, which is one of these, it's pretty damn close to how he lives himself. And he does have, a collection of Marcel Breuer chairs and very beautifully fitting curtains and 4 television sets and 2 videos and 4-car family, the whole bit, which he deserves. And yet, I think there's part of him who would like to be the bomber pilot. I've heard him talk about that bit of the lecture, not the whole lecture, but that bit of it has cropped up several times when I've been in the audience of his lectures, and it is intriguing to me that the bomber pilot always gets the largest bit of the chat. You sort of wonder about that. Does part of him really want to be the bomber pilot? And also the reality of this. There's a particular, now I'm getting local, but there's a particular part of the London suburbs which is, it's a geographical thing, and you get the same characteristics in Los Angeles, after all, where I suspect even I could sniff, if dropped, blindfolded, and blindfold taken away, I think I could probably now begin to tell whether it was Santa Monica or Orange County. I think even I could do that. And certainly in London, there's a weird thing that if you look carefully at the detail of buildings of this period, which is a 1930s mock Tudor suburb, there is a difference between sort of southwest London and northeast London. As you get more to the east, the colours get more garish, they get more bright. And it's weird. At first sight, they seem to be the same sort of houses, but they're not really at all. And Ron lives in the northeast of London, and it's a particular overlay. And maybe his colours are affected by this. If I were collecting anything from, I mean, Ron and I trade drawings, so we don't have to buy each other's drawings. But if I were a collector, I would be very interested in this particular drawing, because I think it tells you, it's extremely handsome, but it also tells you a lot about his predilections. It's interesting to me that the window that he puts in the top story of this suburban house is a modern architecture window. If you look very carefully at that window, it is not the sort of window that you normally get in that house. Now, I'm not sure, Ron isn't here, I'm not sure whether he's making some sort of sly dig about modern architecture, or whether he assumes that nobody will notice that. It's not just done for graphic simplicity. He can draw any kind of window he wants to, but he's drawn this particular window which tells you that the whole thing is phony anyhow, that it's using sort of modern metal window technology stuck into this thing that is supposed to be half timbered. And for me, the drawings, I suppose one is too close to it really. Drawings are interesting in the inconsistencies about them. This is lovely. I think that you know, color Xerox has become a great yawn now. We all rushed and had everything color Xerox a few years ago. Ron is one of the few people who can use it. One of the things I like about color Xerox, and it only very occasionally crops up, does here I think, which is where the process of making the colors acid, you know, they're not really the colors of this model. The green of a color Xerox is always an acid green. The blue is always a funny blue. The red isn't ever right. But it gives it a certain graphic quality. It flattens the thing. It makes it artificial. And suddenly it gets to that point where the model almost becomes drawing. And then, quite characteristically, Ron has just scribbled in something to say, well, the model has become almost drawing, so it is drawing. And I think that this is, I mean, you see that immediately, even though he's scribbled in even more trees, it's back into model land. And here we're into graphic land. And I think that, I'm slightly predating next Monday, but I think that's a territory that we don't consider enough. It's a nice drawing. That, I mean, for Christ's sake, has more to do with Los Angeles than it does Woodford Green, doesn't it? The pool. Now here we are actually with the Eames house remodeled again. And I wonder if the Eameses would have ever gone for this kind of luxury. I think that this is the Englishman's dream of the Eames house, as it might have been to me, and I haven't really looked at the thing properly. The Eames house is still very much in the European mode of the tight designer's statement, and this is still playing designers. It's still got a very organized, almost Germanic window facade, but it's wanting to expand. It's wanting to be Hollywood, you know, somehow. It's something to do with this enormous terrace, and this it's meant to be a roof canopy, I know, but it's like a flag above it. Again, I think this is a very direct drawing. We don't have here in this exhibition the facade drawing. There's a very nice drawing that isn't here, unfortunately, of the yellow facade proposed for the sets for the Queen. And it's interesting to see how that facade develops in the sketches. Now, I'm talking here a little bit into the air because you can't see the final drawing, but if you take my word for it, that the final yellow facade is somewhat in this manner. It is extremely expansive, extremely complete as an architectural object, even though it is making the statement about facadism, as does the rest of the set. And here you see the sketches beginning to build up the idea. like here at this point, the yellow facade is still quite modest, and you see all the working parts. And my hunch is that he sort of starts rethinking this and says, no, if one gives away the game of the working parts, that gives it away too much. Let's develop the idea of this mock castle attached to the actual castle. And by the time it gets to here, the idea is nearly ready to be drawn up fully. I like this plan. Again, these are not my drawings, so I'm just speaking objectively. I like this plan as a plan. I mean, even just nothing to do with the sets thing. I quite like it as a fairly formal composition. I think it should say something to those of you who are students here, who are having worries about setting up rules and then digressing from them. I think it does this very, very relaxedly. It sets up an absolutely ruthless matrix, and then in the most relaxed way plays with that matrix. It proves that you, by setting up a matrix which can carry the structure and carry the servicing, that you don't have to stick in a dull way to it. You can let it just do such a thing, and then you take off from it. I noticed that a lot of people in the lecture the other night were giggling away at the text. It's interesting that. It's interesting that you are one of the few audiences that actually read a text when it's put up on the screen. I don't know what to make of that. I don't know what to make of it, but there it is. You seem to do that. And finally, as I talk about Ron's things, there's this heroic object. For interest on technique, Ron is marvelous at, I mean, he's not lazy at all, but he does sort of post-rationalize certain lazinesses. He didn't draw the whole of this thing ever. What he did was to map out a part of it, draw the elements part of it, and then take a lot of photographic prints, and then combine them, and then slightly distort them and add the legs on. In fact, I think even the leg elements are standardized pieces of drawing. And there is a famous collection in New York of the Gilman Paper Company, who wanted to buy the original Walking City. And Pierre Apraxine, who's their curator, was over in London, and he went round to Ron's house and he said, I want the collection to buy the original Walking City. You know, we have the Bug-in City, and we have Aldo Ross's cemetery, and we have Hans Hollein's aircraft carrier, so we must have the Walking City. And so Ron opened the drawer, where he's more organized than me. He has a very organized sort of plan chest, and he opened the drawer with the bits in it. And the guy said, yes, but I want the original. And then Ron said, well, what original do you want? Do you want the first photograph, the negative of the first photograph, the negative of the bits of the negative, or the drawing that went to make up the negative of the bits? It is this curious thing. We're in a very strange historical moment about architectural drawings, because I think those of us who have always enjoyed drawing and had to or have enjoyed making our architectural statements through drawing still don't really care about the deification of the original. You know, I mean, we're beginning to have to now, because everybody's pressuring us to do so, but we really couldn't care a fuck whether the thing was done on tracing paper or vellum, or, you know, happens to have got screwed up at some point. And it's quite hilarious now that there are one or two collections, the one I've just mentioned, and also the National Architecture Museum in Germany, which is in Frankfurt, which is probably going to be the best 20th century architectural collection. The guy there, the the director of it, is screwy. Has got two guys making laboratory tests on all the drawings that he gets. And we eventually he gets one of your drawings and says, we've put it through the test. It's only going to last 45 years unless we impregnate it with kind of this so-and-so chemical. And you say, oh yes, that's interesting. He says, you don't care, do you? And you say, not really, as long as you give us the money and keep the drawing. But you do care. I mean, it's a very curious thing that one has become involved in this terrible business of the process, which I suspect some of you here this evening want to hear about. This red drawing, and I'll just talk about the process on this and then assume that you've all remembered what I've said, because there are quite a lot of drawings in my part of the thing which use this process. This is an old French invention process, I think 19th century, and it is only available in Paris, London, and Manchester, and I believe Montreal. And in London, there's now only about one old guy still doing it. When I was a student, there were about 4 or 5 places in London where you could get this done. And quite simply, photographic processes and Xerox and so on have taken it over. But it's a beautiful thing because you do an ink drawing in the normal way, and then they pass light through the ink drawing, rather like a dye line, except it's onto a jelly, and they put printer's ink onto the jelly, roll out printer's ink, and then it prints onto the paper. So it's, in effect, in quality, it's rather like a silkscreen print. In technique, I suspect it's rather like a lithograph. And you can specify the color so that, for instance, from the same negative, I could ask for the next one to be done in blue or in green or in purple and so on. Red, I'm rather keen on. I just think it's a very nice color to use with a line drawing, with a completely line drawing. It has a sort of histrionic quality about it. Now, this drawing, as you know, is we agreed, or we decided, to put these two old heroic items next to each other. They're the two out of the 3 or 4 really heroic archigram drawings. You know, the walking city and the plug-in city, and that's archigram kind of thing. I think immediately you can see the differences of our temperament. Ron's object makes its total statement. It's like a lovable sort of animal in a way, and it's complete. And mine is sort of fiddly and picky and a bit neurotic and uses lots of different elements in its hierarchy. Nonetheless, you will notice certain stylistic similarities. There was already, as I must observe, by this date, there must have been a sort of tacit agreement to use a certain aesthetic. I mean, we never talked about it. We never sat down and said, you know, what aesthetic are we going to agree to? It kind of came about that corners were rounded and windows were ovoid or circular, and that certain things would occur on the diagonal, and that the tubes would punch through. I mean, it was never actually discussed in talk, but it happened. And the other thing about this drawing is that it was intended to be located in a very specific part of London, just by Euston Station, north of the centre, running east-west. And so it does actually have a program to it. Now, the thing that has happened between that date and this, which is 15 years, is that the prognosis of the future, as I said in the lecture the other night, the prognosis of the future is much more cynical. One is suggesting that as things change, they finally return to a state very similar to the original state, that if we move forward in time, one gets back to something not so different from where one started. And you will, of course, recognize that this is related to that drawing over there. In fact, that drawing came first and was complete. This is really, in a sense, the theoretical drawing that comes after the event. And that sometimes happens. It's not that one didn't have this in mind all the time, but that is a picture of the riverside of the Arcadia city. Therefore, in order to show that picture, you show everything, the guys fishing, all of the towers, the bit of housing that comes next to it along the riverside. This simply says, now this is the proposition of the tower. The tower starts as a group of 4 corner towers. People move in and start doing things. They start doing more of the things, even on the outside. They start stretching across from one apartment to the next. Then it goes crazy. Then that craziness maybe is formalized, changes back. So it's taking one of the bits and discussing a single aspect of it, perhaps a fairly major aspect, but a single aspect. And I think I'm just about to do the same thing with the last but one drawing on the left-hand side here, which is the one of the rotating offices. In my own head, and I have actually done plans of that some time ago, not very good drawings, but just scribbled around. I know exactly what the building must do in terms of its system, in terms of its proposition. It is, in fact, a series of rotating of elements that stick out in one of 4 directions as they climb, so you always get a 3-floor gap between the next slab, as it were, so it goes around like that. Now that's a sort of straight mechanistic architectural idea, probably as stated thus rather boring. On the other hand, I'm not sure whether that comes across from the drawing, and it is an important aspect of the scheme, you know, and therefore it is necessary to draw it. Now it might be possible to do with it what one did with this, which was that in taking a single aspect of a scheme and describing it, you start to throw up other ideas as well. Like this is, to me, much more evocative, or has certain evocations which are not present in that, complete though that may be. That is as if the scheme is frozen about here, but one is saying that could actually develop to this state. Now, I've never had the wit or stamina to redo that drawing with this degree of expressionism. That would be a fantastic thing to do. But maybe somebody else ought to do that, because there is a point at which you've actually, this is always a danger, there's a point at which you've worked the idea through in your head, and to actually draw everything that is implicit in the idea would become a kind of chore. Albeit that I know in the back of my mind that if I could imagine that drawing with this degree of goings on, I mean, it would take a while to draw, and it would be a knockout. But I think I've worked the idea through in my, I mean, you can't go sort of back over that ground. Were coloured. Yeah, they're a different set. Yeah, they're in Germany. This is an earlier project than that. And there was a point when I wanted to list out a series of elements. I was advising some students this afternoon that what they should do would be to chart a series of elements, a series of typologies for the parts of the building. And that's all this is. This is an idea saying the sponge is a way of refacing an existing structure. And the sponge, in order to have a vocabulary for the sponge, one will have to look at openings, corners, facades, entrances, and so on. These are 4 out of a total set of about 9 drawings, of which this is a key facade, and that is a section. Now you can probably tell that this came later than that. These were done first. And this is meant to be a sort of replacement for windows. It's a pretty spooky replacement for windows, but it's to do with openings in the skin. And I've been preoccupied for years with the idea of a gradual transition through slight translucency, more translucency to transparency as a sort of a building where you didn't actually have a window or a solid wall, but it just slowly moved from one to the other. And the scheme that Christine Hawley and I did, called the Via Appia House, which I don't have here, but may show you in a lecture, that took that a stage further. This was done before the Via Appia House. That, as I said in the lecture, is one of my own personal favourites. It's one which a lot of friends of mine don't like. I don't know whether they think it's rude or nasty, or they don't like the colour, but I've had a lot of rude comments from friends of mine. Bloody guns thing of yours. But I like it because it's not because it's obscene, but because it's trying to get at the possibility of an architecture made out of objets trouvés. These two, the mound, the lump, was attempting to dematerialize the building. It was attempting to say, if you just have ground and there's a bit of building inserted into it, and then you come inside it, and in fact you find it's a total building all the time. And this has been referred to by somebody or other a long time ago as P. Cook in his Captain Nemo period. That's a sort of funny favourite. I mean, this is a drawing that didn't really work. I mean, it didn't come out like I wanted it to, and I can't get it any different. I mean, that's looking out from that opening, as you can see. Very weird one. It has sort of no relationship to anything else. Well, this I've alluded to some extent. And its brother, I suppose, is another drawing which I don't have here, called the Sleek building. It's to do with artificiality as well. It's to do with sort of trying to do more dim-gem than dim-gem, you know, but in colour, I suppose. The two drawings at the bottom come into quite a different category. They were originally produced as part of a competition which Christine Hawley and I made for a library building in Norway. And because in England we don't have very many competitions, we go in for foreign competitions. We pretend we're Norwegians, or we pretend we're Germans, or we work with friends, you know, borrow their name and things like that, just in order to try and get something to bloody well build. And this we did very, very difficult competition. The other thing about it was, just talking about competition, is that our students were doing it simultaneously, and also some various friends. So there was a whole circuit of people in London doing this particular competition project, some of whom were teachers, some of whom were students, and you were in effect competing against your own students, or they against you, except that none of us got anywhere in the competition. Anyway, the Norwegians couldn't stand any of the schemes that we sent them. So they were all decadent and coloured and hairy and terrible things. But another thing I want to talk about, which is that certain projects are very important to you, and other ones are more popular, or other ones are more easily digested. You know, and one has one's own favourites. I'm going to come on to that in a moment. But the Sleek building, which you may have seen on the cover of A+U, and it's been on the cover of 2 or 3 other magazines. It's a very nice image. It's a nice sort of sleek thing, and it's like that on a corner. And it's very powerful and immediately identifiable, apropos the points I was making earlier this afternoon. But to me, it doesn't have a great deal of content. It was a nice, quick idea, and it looks pretty, but it doesn't have a lot of pain in it. It wasn't difficult to actually come up with. This scheme, I don't think it's painful either, but it took a long time. It was two of us with one assistant worked on it for several months, and and threw in a lot of ideas. And the curious thing is then that this particular scheme has given fuel for other projects subsequently. It's got a sort of 3 or 4 year lifespan of feeding in ideas, particularly the mesh idea, which crops up over there, as you know. And it's a pity I haven't got the original of this. This is a nice one, but that was bought by a Japanese foundation way back. That's a throwback to the Instant City. I thought it would be a pity if I didn't have one Instant City drawing, because the Instant City was a project that Ron and I did, while a lot of it whilst we were in Los Angeles the first time in 1968, 69. It's a long time ago. So that's why he's there. But it's a bit sad because he's one poor little drawing out of a whole series, which now mostly sit in the German Architecture Museum. This is, again, for me, an important sequence because, again, it's, as with the towers, it's to do with metamorphosis. The towers metamorphose from a simple group of 4 towers through to a complex infilling and then gradually simplify again. In the case of this metamorphosis, these state the general parameters, and the first of the development shows this armature with a complete city on it. Prefabricated buildings, architect design buildings, sort of tents for communes, caravan parks, a street, and so on. And there's only a minor shift between this one and this one. If you have to look moderately close at it, you see that some of the prefabricated buildings have been peeled away and something has replaced it. Some sort of nasty tents and huts have started to come in. And there's a vegetable building has cropped up in place of this rather sort of straightforward piece of building here. By this stage, there's much more vegetable building, and and very few of the prefabricated straight up and down buildings are left, and it's all starting to get very spooky. More tents and huts and floppy things around. By this stage, even the armature has started to, in fact, has disintegrated a lot. There's just a few pieces of it left. By this stage, there's only a vestige of the architecture as such left. And then by this stage, it's like a sort of moon landscape with the proposition of 2 alternative futures, 2 alternative cycles. Either that the civilization that started here has completely died out, or conversely, that this is being inhabited by a very, very sophisticated civilization for whom this is the architecture, whereas this was really rather ordinary architecture. So that's the story of that one. This is a drawing, a copy reduced. The original drawing is 5 foot by 3 feet, quite a large drawing, and is one of 2 which discuss one's ideas over a series of projects. You can recognize that that bit is actually that, and that these towers again are quoted, and this is a quotation of a nice scheme I did, one I like, called I shouldn't say things like that, but I do enjoy it, the prepared landscape. And then there's some bits that are introduced new, and some bits that are fed in that I've never really developed, like taking a much more complicated section through a mound or a lump. And I put it all together, and then I wrote about it along the edge. I've sort of written comments on it. These comments are reproduced in legible text in the issue, the Cook Hawley issue of A+U, so it can actually be read. I don't know what one says about it. Quite a useful, I mean, I like this drawing in a way, and it's almost like a note. I mean, it's the nearest I get to Ron's sketches, even though it's an after the event thing, in the sense that one is jotting down a whole series of ideas that have cropped up and discussing them one to the other. Now this batch of stuff from here to where the pair of where that lady's standing there, are quite a large part of the Arcadia project. It's a proposition for a city with an estuary and hills rising on this side and on that side. And I did quite a lot of scribbling around of the map before I started any of the drawings, with the exception of this one. This was actually done before the map and uses a little bit of the Via Appia house as an apartment block, and then talks about the idea of a suburban block or a suburban garden with the apartments facing the street. There's the street. This is a sort of axonometric looking over the top, just like Ron's one was. And between the apartment blocks are some smaller apartment blocks, and in front of them are houses in the hedge houses, which are these. And behind them is this spooky garden with a few special little houses that look like trees in them. And behind that is the wall that goes round the edge, with even the odd house on the wall. And then the garden is very sort of Grimm's fairy tale, very heavy with waterfalls and tunnels and so on this side, an orchard in the middle, and then a rather municipal flat lawn with rose bushes garden on the other side. Now, coming out of that was then the town. This is the town hall. That's it in plan here with the road intersection. The tower marking it as the kind of dominant building, the seat of power, campanile, in the tradition of the campanile to the town hall in Italian cities. The secretariat of the town hall is there. The organization, this dominant organization, breaks down here into sort of one-man office operation. That then turns under the freeway into a sort of amoebic market hall and a market square with individual shops which have their backs into the ground. So it's a very, these sort of rather artificial objects sit out of the ground. So you can probably gather a lot of my preoccupation has been to do with the contrast between artificiality on the one hand and nature on the other. This is an elevation of that building looking, here we are, that's the plan, looking at this side. That's its elevation. This, which the other night I talked about at length, the loft facade, is actually the facade of this street. Here we are looking here. The wobbly corner is that. The campanile is that. And then the hill is rising up very slowly here. Rising up there. And in fact, you see, not only is the top of the building crumbling, the top crumbles, the sides are metal facades, but in fact the back is crumbling. So it's only really this front that is dogmatic. This is a drawing of one of these parts, housing within a regular grid, but the means of access is irregular. This is the interior of, I don't have the drawing here of the main view of these buildings, but this apartment sits in there. It's part of one of these pieces of housing, and it's for very sort of artificial, it's for people who live a very hectic, artificial, urban life. And so you give them 2 bathrooms and a conservatory that only has sort of plastic plants in it, because they wouldn't piss about watering real plants. It's a very highly packaged bathroom. and architecture is an available extra. It sort of becomes a status symbol to stick a piece of architecture on. And the walls are glass. I've had this idea for a long time about a illuminated corridor. Well, the really high luxury thing is that you get in a hotel or a service apartment, sort of full carpeted thing, full air conditioned thing and so on. If only you could get just light percolating through. Absolutely marvelous. It means that you do just get a shadowy glimpse of the people next door through the thing. Now here, I come, do you want me to turn, with SCI-Arc we're very conscious of the media the whole time, so I have to turn to the machine. This is what I'm working on right now, which is this, and a whole series of maps, of which this is only one. Those of you who've seen the Romantic Houses issue of AD, or other lectures I've given, will recognize the shadow house. This is part of the plan of the shadow house. And this is taking us across the street from the shadow house and the beginning of the rotating offices. This is the plan of one set of rotating offices, and this is the beginning of some pavilions and some more rotating offices. Now, there's a section through the shadow house, the street, the water falling down waterfalls past the offices and going on and on downhill. This is a series of green swathes which are contained pieces of woodland with houses clinging up against them. So all the houses have this little sort of private path, which is a wooded path. But it's also a kind of mesh as well. And the facade of the offices, the facade chosen here is the rather neo-50s facade, as it happens, which I'm interested in at the moment. This is a series of those rotating offices down the hill. So that is a variant on that, if you like.